Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. You know what scares me the most? It's not monsters or ghosts. It's the moment when you realize you made a terrible mistake. Tonight, I found 7 stories, all from the Appalachian Mountains, all during snow nights. And trust me, after hearing these, you'll understand why locals never stop when someone waves for help on those dark mountain roads. Before we start, hit subscribe. You're gonna want to come back for more. Like the video, and hey, drop your location in the comments. I'm curious who's brave enough to watch this alone. All right, here's the deal. Every story tonight actually happened. Real names, real places, real fear. So get comfortable, or don't. Let's see what's hiding in the snow. My name's Jennifer, and I'm 38. I work as a nurse at Charlotte Presbyterian, night shift in the ER, which means I've seen pretty much everything you can imagine. Blood, trauma, people at their absolute worst moments. I tell you this because I need you to understand that I'm not someone who scares easily or makes up stories for attention. This happened 3 winters ago, February 2023, when my husband Mike and I took our twin daughters Emma and Sophie up to the mountains for what was supposed to be their first real snow experience. The girls had just turned 12, and they'd been begging us for years to see actual mountains, actual snow deeper than the dusting we sometimes get in Charlotte. Mike's an electrician, steady work but not wealthy by any stretch, and we'd been saving for almost 2 years to afford even a long weekend somewhere decent. We found this place online called White Rock Cabin Rentals, about 40 miles northwest of Asheville, up in some unnamed hollow that doesn't show up on most maps. The website was basic, but the photos looked perfect. Individual cabins scattered through old-growth forest, each one private and quiet. No resort crowds, no overpriced lodge food, just families getting back to basics. The price was right, and the owner, this older mountain woman named Mrs. Dalton, sounded genuine when I called to book. The girls spent weeks preparing, watching YouTube videos about building snow forts, practicing layering clothes, making lists of everything they wanted to try. Emma's more cautious by nature, but Sophie's always been the one to jump first and ask questions later. They were bouncing off the walls that Friday afternoon when Mike got home from work and we loaded up the SUV. The drive up took longer than expected. Once you get past Asheville, the roads turn into these narrow, winding mountain routes that seem to go on forever, climbing higher into country that feels older somehow. The GPS kept losing signal, and Mike had to stop twice to check the handwritten directions Mrs. Dalton had mailed us. "Old school," she'd said on the phone. "Don't trust them satellites up here. Paper don't lie." We passed maybe 3 other vehicles in the last hour of driving. The few houses we saw were set way back from the road, wood smoke rising from chimneys, yellow light glowing from windows that looked warm and safe. It was getting dark by the time we found the turnoff, just a gravel road with a weathered wooden sign that said White Rock in hand-carved letters. Mrs. Dalton met us at what she called the main house, though it was really just a larger cabin with a wraparound porch and gardens that were probably beautiful in spring. She was exactly what you'd picture. Maybe 70, gray hair in a neat bun, wearing a wool sweater that looked hand-knitted. But her eyes were sharp, alert, and when she shook hands with Mike and me, her grip was surprisingly strong. "Y'all picked a good weekend," she said, leading us into her living room to sign papers and get keys. "Weather says snow tonight, clearing tomorrow. Your girl's gonna love it." She handed Emma and Sophie each a mason jar of what turned out to be homemade hot chocolate mix and smiled at their excitement. "Your cabin's about a mile up the hollow. Trails marked, but you take your time getting up there." These mountain roads can be tricky in the dark. Our cabin was called Laurel Rest, and it was perfect. 2 bedrooms upstairs, living room with a stone fireplace downstairs, kitchen stocked with basic supplies, and windows that looked out into forest so thick you couldn't see lights from any other cabins. Mike got a fire going while I unpacked, and the girls explored every corner, claiming their beds and discussing plans for the morning. The snow started around 10 that night, just as Mrs. Dalton had predicted. Big, fat flakes that caught the light from our porch and disappeared into the darkness beyond. The girls pressed their faces to the upstairs windows until I made them come to bed, promising they could play in it first thing in the morning. I woke up around 3 a.m. to complete silence. If you've never experienced mountain quiet during a snowfall, it's hard to describe. No traffic, no neighbors, no electrical hum, just perfect stillness that felt almost alive. I checked the girls' room and found them sleeping peacefully, then looked out to see snow still falling steadily. There had to be 8 or 10 inches accumulated already. Saturday morning was everything we'd hoped for. The girls shrieked with joy when they saw how much snow had fallen overnight, and we spent the entire day outside, building snowmen, having snowball fights, taking hundreds of photos. Mike and I made snow angels while the girls tried to catch snowflakes on their tongues. It was the kind of perfect family day you plan for months and somehow never quite expect to actually happen. The only odd thing was how isolated we felt. Mrs. Dalton had mentioned other families staying in cabins nearby, but we never saw or heard anyone else. No children's voices, no car engines, no smoke from other chimneys. Just us and the endless white forest. Mike commented on it over lunch, looking out at all that emptiness. Guess we really are off the beaten path up here. That evening, after hot showers and a dinner of soup and grilled cheese, we decided to take a walk before bed. The snow had stopped, and the moon was full, turning everything into this magical silver landscape. The girls bundled up in their new winter coats, and we headed out with flashlights, planning to follow the gravel road back toward Mrs. Dalton's house and maybe see some of the other cabins. The moonlight was so bright we barely needed the flashlights. Our boots crunched in the snow, and the girls were still giddy from the day, running ahead and circling back to us like puppies. Sophie pointed out animal tracks crossing our path. Rabbit, maybe. Deer. Emma was identifying constellations in the clear sky between the bare tree branches. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when Emma stopped and pointed ahead. "Mom, why are there footprints going into the woods?" I looked where she was pointing. Leading off the gravel road and into the trees was a clear line of footprints in the snow. Not boot prints like ours, but bare human feet. Adult-sized, with toes clearly defined in the snow. The prints led straight into the forest, disappearing between the dark trees. Mike aimed his flashlight along the trail. "That's weird. Who walks barefoot in snow like this?" "Maybe someone's dog got loose," I suggested, though I knew dog prints don't look anything like human feet. Sophie, always the brave one, started to follow the prints into the trees. "Let's see where they go." "Absolutely not," Mike said, catching her arm. "We're staying on the road." But as we continued walking, we found more barefoot tracks. Dozens of them, all leading off the road in different directions, all disappearing into the dark forest. Some were adult-sized, others looked smaller. Child-sized. The girls were getting nervous now. Emma grabbed my hand and whispered, "Mommy, why would kids be walking around barefoot in the snow?" I didn't have an answer for that. We decided to turn back toward our cabin, but as we walked, I kept thinking about those tracks, how fresh they'd looked, how clear the toe prints were, like someone had walked through that snow just minutes before we arrived. Back at the cabin, Mike built up the fire while I made hot chocolate. The girls were tired from all the fresh air and activity, and they went upstairs to bed without their usual complaints and negotiations. Mike and I sat by the fire listening to the wood pop and crackle, both of us thinking about those strange tracks, but neither wanting to bring them up again. Around midnight, I was awakened by the sound of footsteps on our porch. Slow, deliberate steps, walking from one end to the other, then back again. I lay in bed listening, thinking maybe it was an animal, but the rhythm was too regular, too purposeful. Step, 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 pause. Step, 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 pause. Mike was snoring softly beside me, and I didn't want to wake him. I slipped out of bed and crept to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The porch was empty, but in the snow beyond I could see fresh barefoot tracks leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the trees. I checked on the girls, both sleeping peacefully in their beds, Emma clutching her stuffed rabbit, Sophie sprawled across her mattress like she always did at home. I stood in their doorway for a long time, listening to their steady breathing, trying to convince myself that everything was normal. The footsteps on the porch started again around 2 a.m. This time Mike woke up too. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. We both lay there listening. The steps were slower now, more deliberate, and they were accompanied by something else. A soft scratching sound, like fingernails on wood. Mike grabbed his flashlight and went to the living room window. I followed, my heart pounding. The porch was empty again, but this time there were marks on the wooden railing, long scratches in the wood, like someone had been running their fingernails along it while they walked. "Should we call Mrs. Dalton?" I whispered. Mike checked his phone. No signal. We'd noticed it yesterday too, but hadn't thought much about it. Mountain country, spotty cell coverage, no big deal. "Maybe it's just kids from one of the other cabins," Mike said, but he didn't sound convinced. You know how kids are playing pranks. Barefoot kids walking around in below freezing temperatures, playing pranks at 2 in the morning. I wanted to believe it, but nothing about this felt like a prank. The scratching sound started up again, but now it was coming from multiple directions. The porch railing, the side of the cabin, the windows. Like several people were outside, all running their fingernails along our cabin walls. Emma appeared at the top of the stairs, rubbing her eyes. "Mommy? What's that noise?" "Nothing, sweetie. Go back to bed." But Sophie was awake now too, standing beside her sister, both girls looking scared. "It sounds like someone's trying to get in," Sophie whispered. Mike grabbed a poker from the fireplace and went to the front door. "Who's out there?" he called through the wood. The scratching stopped immediately. Complete silence. Mike waited a full minute, then slowly opened the door and stepped onto the porch, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. No one. But the scratches on the railing were deeper now, and there were more of them. "Daddy, look at the trees," Emma said from behind me. I turned to see what she was pointing at through the living room window. In the moonlight, I could see dozens of figures standing motionless among the trees surrounding our cabin. Tall, thin shapes that looked almost human, but wrong somehow. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. "Mike," I called, my voice barely above a whisper. "Come back inside, now." He must have heard something in my tone because he didn't ask questions, just stepped back through the door and locked it behind him. I told him what the girls had seen, and we all gathered at the window to look. The figures were closer now, close enough that we could make out details. They were human-shaped, but too tall, too thin, with arms that hung too long at their sides. Their skin was pale, almost luminous in the moonlight, and they weren't wearing clothes. Most disturbing of all, none of them had feet. Their legs simply ended at the ankles, and they stood balanced on the stumps, snow packed up around them. "What are those?" Sophie whispered. Before anyone could answer, one of the figures raised its arm and pointed directly at our window. At us. The gesture was slow and deliberate, and somehow I knew it could see us looking back. Then, all at once, every figure in the woods started walking toward our cabin. They moved wrong, their two long arms swaying, their truncated legs carrying them forward in a gliding motion that didn't match any natural gait. Some of them were making soft sounds, not quite humming, not quite singing, but a low melodic noise that seemed to come from deep in their chests. "Upstairs," Mike said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Everyone upstairs. Now." We herded the girls up to their bedroom and huddled together on Emma's bed. Mike positioned himself by the window with the fireplace poker while I held both girls against me, feeling their small bodies trembling. The humming sound was getting louder, and now there were footsteps on the porch again. But not the footsteps of feet, something else, moving across the wooden boards with wet, sliding sounds. "Mommy, I'm scared," Emma whispered. "I know, baby. It's going to be okay." But I didn't believe it. Whatever was outside wasn't human, and I had no idea what it wanted or how to protect my family from it. The scratching started again, but now it was on the cabin walls right below us. Long, deliberate scratches, like something was trying to carve its way inside. The girls pressed closer to me, and Mike gripped the poker so tight his knuckles were white. Then, suddenly, complete silence. We waited, barely breathing, for what felt like hours. Finally, Mike crept to the window and looked out. The woods were empty. No figures, no movement, just moonlight on snow and the dark shapes of trees. "They're gone," he whispered. But I noticed something else. In the snow around our cabin, there were no tracks, no footprints, no evidence that anything had been there at all. The scratches on the porch railing and cabin walls were gone too, like they'd never existed. "Did we all dream that?" Sophie asked. I knew we hadn't. The memory was too clear, too shared. All four of us had seen the same thing, heard the same sounds. But without any physical evidence, how could we prove it had happened? We didn't sleep the rest of that night. Mike and I took turns keeping watch while the girls dozed fitfully between us. When dawn finally came, everything looked normal again. Beautiful even. Fresh snow, peaceful forest, the kind of winter morning that makes you grateful to be alive. Over breakfast, we talked about leaving early. Mike said maybe we should pack up and head home, that the whole experience had been too unsettling. But the girls begged to stay. It was their first snow vacation, and in the daylight, with coffee and pancakes and a warm fire, the night before seemed impossible. "Maybe it was just our imaginations," Emma said. "You know how scary things can seem in the dark." Sophie nodded eagerly. "And we drove so far to get here. Can't we stay one more night?" Against my better judgment, we decided to stay. The day was beautiful, and we spent it building an elaborate snow fort, having snowball fights, and taking more family photos. Mike and I kept exchanging looks, both of us on edge, but nothing unusual happened. No strange tracks, no sounds, no figures in the woods. Mrs. Dalton stopped by in the afternoon, driving up in an old pickup truck to check on us. She seemed pleased that we were enjoying ourselves, and when Mike casually asked about wildlife in the area, she just smiled. "Oh, you might see deer, maybe a bear if you're unlucky. Nothing to worry about, though." These mountains been safe for families for generations. She didn't mention anything about other guests or other cabins, and when I looked around, I realized I still hadn't seen any evidence of other people staying nearby. No car tracks in the snow, no smoke from chimneys, no lights in the distance. That second night, we were more prepared. Mike moved a dresser in front of the door and kept the fireplace poker within reach. We put the girls to bed early and sat by the fire, both of us trying to read but really just listening for any unusual sounds. Around 11, it started again. First, the humming, soft and low, coming from multiple directions in the forest around us. Then the footsteps on the porch, that same wet, sliding sound. Mike and I looked at each other, and I saw my own fear reflected in his eyes. "Should we wake the girls?" I whispered. Before he could answer, there was a soft tapping on the living room window. Not urgent or aggressive, just a gentle tap, 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 like someone asking politely to be let in. We crept to the window and peered through the curtain. One of those pale figures was standing on our porch, close enough that we could see its face clearly for the first time. It looked human, but stretched. Features too long, eyes too large, mouth that seemed to go back too far into its skull. It saw us looking and tilted its head, almost like a curious dog. Then it smiled. The smile was the worst part. Too wide, showing too many teeth, expressing something that might have been meant as friendliness but felt utterly alien. It raised one impossibly long arm and waved at us, fingers moving independently like they weren't connected to the same nervous system. More figures appeared, filling our porch, pressing against the windows. All of them looking in at us with those too large eyes. All of them smiling those terrible smiles. One of them began writing something in the condensation on the window glass, but the letters were backwards, mirror image, like it was trying to communicate but didn't understand how human writing worked. The humming grew louder, and now I could make out that it was almost like a lullaby. A slow, repetitive melody that might have been soothing if it wasn't coming from creatures that shouldn't exist. Upstairs, one of the girls started crying, soft, frightened sobs that cut through the humming like a knife. "Emma," I whispered, and started toward the stairs. Mike caught my arm. "Don't leave me alone down here." But I couldn't leave my daughter crying and scared. I grabbed the flashlight and crept upstairs, Mike following close behind with the poker. Both girls were awake, huddled together in Emma's bed, staring at the window. Outside, more pale figures were gathered in the trees, swaying slightly as they hummed. Some of them were smaller than the others, child-sized. "Mommy," Sophie whispered, "why do some of them look like kids?" I looked more carefully and felt my blood turn to ice. The smaller figures weren't just child-sized. They had children's faces, pale, stretched versions of children's faces, but recognizably young. And they were all looking directly at our window, all smiling those horrible smiles. One of the child things raised its hand and waved, the same way the adult had downstairs. Then it opened its mouth and called out in a voice that was almost human but not quite. "Come play with us. Come play in the snow." The other child things took up the call, their voices blending with the humming in a chorus that made my skin crawl. "Come play, come play. The snow is so nice." Emma buried her face in my shoulder. "I don't want to play with them, Mommy. Something's wrong with them." Sophie, braver than her sister but still trembling, stared out at the gathered figures. "How come they don't have feet? How do they walk without feet?" I didn't have an answer. I just held both girls close and tried to think of what to do. We were trapped in the cabin with those things surrounding us, no phone signal, no way to call for help, and at least 12 hours until daylight. The humming stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like being underwater. Then, one by one, the figures began to fade. Not walking away, not moving at all, just becoming transparent and disappearing like smoke. Within minutes, they were all gone. The woods were empty again, peaceful and still under the moonlight. "What just happened?" Mike whispered. This time, there were tracks in the snow, dozens of them, leading up to the cabin and then simply stopping, as if the creatures had materialized from nothing, approached our windows, then vanished back into nothing. We spent the rest of the night in the girls' room, all four of us crowded onto Emma's bed, taking turns keeping watch. Nobody slept. When dawn finally broke, we packed our bags in silence and loaded the car. Mrs. Dalton was waiting for us at the main house, sitting on her porch with a cup of coffee like she'd been expecting us. "Checking out early?" she asked, but something in her expression suggested she already knew why. Mike returned the keys without explanation, and we loaded the girls into the SUV. As we drove down the mountain, I looked back once and saw Mrs. Dalton still sitting on her porch, watching us leave with an expression I couldn't read. The ride home was quiet. The girls slept in the back seat, exhausted from their sleepless night, and Mike and I drove without talking, both of us processing what we'd experienced. When we got home, I started researching. What I found made everything worse. White Rock Cabin Rentals had no website. The phone number I'd called was disconnected. The address Mrs. Dalton had given us led to empty forest land that had been uninhabited for decades. I found newspaper articles from the 1940s about missing families in that area. Hikers who went into the mountains and were never found. Children who wandered away from camping trips and disappeared without a trace. Most disturbing was an interview with a Cherokee elder from the 1960s, talking about the old stories from that region. He described creatures called the Pale Walkers, spirits of people who had died in the mountains during harsh winters, who appeared as elongated, footless figures that tried to lure the living to join them in their endless wandering. According to the elder, the Pale Walkers were especially drawn to children, mimicking their voices and appearing in childlike forms to convince families to come out and play in the snow. Those who followed them were never seen again. The article included a crude drawing based on traditional descriptions. Tall, pale figures with 2 long arms and no feet gathered around a cabin in the woods. It looked exactly like what we'd seen. I never told the girls what I'd learned. They're 15 now, and they still don't like snow. Emma refuses to go camping or stay in cabins, and Sophie has nightmares sometimes about children calling for her to come outside and play. Mike and I have never talked about that weekend directly, but I catch him sometimes staring out windows on winter nights, like he's watching for something. We never found any record of Mrs. Dalton or the cabin we stayed in. Our photos from that weekend are strange. The backgrounds don't quite look right. The lighting seems wrong, and in some of them, you can see pale shapes moving between the trees that I swear weren't there when we took the pictures. Sometimes I wonder if we really escaped that mountain, or if we're still there somehow, still huddled in that cabin while things that used to be human press their faces against our windows and hum lullabies in voices that sound almost like children. The worst part is the doubt. Did it really happen? Are my memories reliable? But then I look at my daughters, see how they both react to snow the same way, see the fear in their eyes when winter comes. And I know, those mountains are still out there, those things are still waiting, and somewhere, there might be other families who think they're just taking their kids on a nice winter vacation, driving up winding mountain roads toward cabins that shouldn't exist, to meet creatures that died long ago but haven't learned how to stay dead. If you ever get an urge to rent a cabin in unnamed mountain hollows, if you find deals that seem too good to be true from friendly older women who prefer phone calls to websites, maybe reconsider. Maybe choose somewhere else. Somewhere with crowds and noise and electric lights that keep the darkness at bay. Because some mountains keep their own kind of snow, and some things that look like children aren't calling you out to play. They're calling you home. I'm 26 years old, and I work nights at the Walmart in Frostbite Ridge, Tennessee. It's not exactly where I thought I'd end up after high school, but nursing school costs money, and the overnight shift pays $1 more an hour than days. Plus, honestly, I've always been more of a night person anyway. Frostbite Ridge is one of those tiny mountain towns where everybody knows everybody. Population maybe 3,000 on a good day. Most folks around here work either at the lumber mill or drive down to Knoxville for jobs. But the Walmart stays open 24 hours because we're right off Highway 32, the main route through the mountains. Truckers stop in, late travelers, people heading to the hospital in the next county over. I've been working there about 3 years now, ever since I graduated, and I figured I had the night shift routine down pretty well. Stock shelves, clean up, help the occasional customer who wanders in at 2 a.m. looking for medicine or snacks. Simple enough work that lets me study during the quiet hours. The thing about working nights in a small mountain town is that you get used to being alone with your thoughts. Most nights, especially in winter, I'd see maybe 5 people total between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. The store felt like this weird little bubble of fluorescent light in the middle of all that dark mountain wilderness. I'd put in my earbuds, listen to podcasts or music, and just zone out while I worked. My manager, Janet, trusted me enough to leave me completely alone most nights. She'd lock up at closing, I'd come in through the employee entrance, and I wouldn't see another soul until she came back in the morning. It was peaceful, in a way. I could study for my nursing classes between stocking the canned goods, practice flashcards while I mopped floors. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady, and I was making progress toward my degree. I lived in a little apartment above the hardware store on Main Street, walking distance from work. My parents had moved to Florida a couple years back when Dad retired from the mill, so it was just me and my cat, Duchess, holding down the Rodriguez family presence in Frostbite Ridge. Most of my high school friends had left for college or jobs in bigger cities, but I liked the quiet. I liked knowing my neighbors. Liked that Mrs. Henderson from the diner would save me a piece of pie when I got off work in the morning. I had a routine, you know. Simple, but it worked for me. I figured I'd finish nursing school, maybe get a job at the regional medical center, stay in the area. The mountains had always felt like home to me, even when they got lonely sometimes. That all changed on January 8th, 2022. The Weather Service had been warning us about what they called a historic ice storm event coming through the mountains. I remember watching the news that afternoon before my shift, seeing the meteorologist talking about how the temperature was going to drop just enough to turn all the rain into freezing rain, coating everything in ice. They were predicting power outages, travel becoming impossible, the whole 9 yards. But I'd worked through plenty of winter storms before, and Janet had already called to confirm I'd still be coming in. The store had a generator, good heating, and somebody needed to be there in case of emergencies. Plus, if I called out, I wouldn't get paid, and I had tuition due at the end of the month. The ice started falling right around 9 p.m., just as I was getting ready to walk to work. I could hear it hitting my apartment windows, that distinctive ticking sound that meant the temperature was hovering right at that dangerous point where rain turns to ice the second it touches anything. By the time I made it to the store, the parking lot was already getting slippery. Janet was just finishing up the closing procedures, counting down the register, doing the final walkthrough. She looked worried when she saw me. "You sure you want to stay tonight, Ashley?" she asked, jingling her keys. "This storm's supposed to get real bad. I could try to find someone to cover, maybe close early." But I needed the hours, and honestly, I'd rather be in the store with heat and lights than sitting in my apartment listening to ice accumulate on the power lines. "I'll be fine," I told her. "Got plenty to do tonight anyway. Need to stock the whole pharmacy section." She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't happy about leaving me. "Keep your phone on you, and if anything happens, if you feel unsafe at all, you call me, okay? I don't care what time it is." She handed me the keys and headed out into what was already becoming a pretty serious ice storm. By midnight, I knew this wasn't going to be a normal night. I could look out the front windows and see that every car in the parking lot was completely encased in ice, like they'd been dipped in glass. The ice was thick enough that I couldn't even see through the windshields anymore. The whole world outside looked like it had been frozen in crystal, and the only sounds were the occasional crack of tree branches giving way under the weight of the ice and that constant ticking against the windows. I'd never seen anything quite like it, even growing up in the mountains where ice storms weren't exactly uncommon. I was restocking the pharmacy aisles, working my way through cases of cold medicine and vitamins when the banging started. Loud, desperate pounding on the front doors that echoed through the empty store. My heart jumped. Nobody should have been out in this weather, and the roads had to be completely impassable by now. But the banging continued, frantic and urgent, and when I looked toward the entrance, I could see figures pressed against the glass. There were 4 of them, 2 adults and 2 kids, all soaked to the bone and shivering so violently I could see it even from across the store. The man was pounding on the door with both fists, and I could hear him shouting something, though the words were muffled by the glass and the sound of ice still hitting the building. The woman was holding the children close to her, and even from a distance, I could see they looked hypothermic. The kids couldn't have been more than 8 or 10 years old, and they were barely standing. "Please," the man shouted loud enough that I could make it out clearly now. "Our car slid off the road. We need shelter. Please, our children are freezing." I stood there for a second, torn. I wasn't supposed to let anyone in after closing. That was a strict policy. But these people looked like they were in serious danger, and turning away a family with kids in weather like this felt like signing their death warrant. The kids looked blue around the lips, and the woman was swaying on her feet like she might collapse. This was exactly the kind of emergency situation that Janet had said I should use my judgment about. I hurried to the front doors and unlocked them. The family practically fell inside, dripping ice water all over the entrance mat and gasping with relief. Up close, I could see they were in even worse shape than I'd realized. Their clothes were soaked through and starting to freeze, and all of them were shaking uncontrollably. "Thank God," the man said, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely get the words out. "Thank God you were here. I'm Jim Peterson. This is my wife Linda, and these are our kids, Sarah and Michael." Linda was trying to warm the children with her hands, rubbing their arms and whispering to them. "We were driving to the regional medical center," she explained, her voice shaky. "Michael has asthma, and he was having trouble breathing. But we hit black ice on Route 32, went right off the road into the ditch. We walked maybe 2 miles through the storm to get here," Jim added. "Saw the lights, knew someone had to be inside. You probably saved our lives." Looking at them, I believed it. The kids were barely conscious, just leaning against their parents and shivering. I knew enough from my nursing classes to recognize the early stages of hypothermia when I saw it. "Come on," I said, leading them toward the back of the store. "Let me get you some dry clothes and blankets." I grabbed blankets and some sweatshirts from the camping section, found a space heater that I plugged in near the break room. While they changed into dry clothes, I started a pot of coffee in the employee kitchen and found some snacks to help them get their energy back up. Within an hour, they were looking much better. The color had returned to the kids' faces, and they'd stopped that violent shivering. "I can't thank you enough," Linda said, wrapping her hands around a cup of coffee. "Most people wouldn't have opened their doors to strangers in the middle of the night." "Especially not in a storm like this," Jim agreed. "You're an angel, Ashley." We settled into an easy conversation after that. They told me about their life in Virginia, how they'd been visiting family in the area when Michael's asthma flared up. The kids warmed up enough to start exploring a little, staying close to their parents but looking around the store with that curiosity kids have even in stressful situations. Sarah found a deck of cards, and we played a few rounds of Go Fish while we waited for the storm to pass. It felt nice, actually, having company for once during the long night shift. But around 3 a.m., I started noticing things that didn't quite add up. It was small stuff at first. When Jim walked past the freezer section, his breath didn't fog like mine did in the cold air. Linda mentioned they were from Richmond, but then later said they lived in Norfolk. Michael told me his favorite subject was math, but when I asked him about a simple multiplication problem, he looked confused and gave an answer that didn't make sense for a 10-year-old. The thing that really got my attention, though, was when I glanced down and realized none of them were casting shadows under the fluorescent lights. I was standing right next to Linda, and my shadow stretched across the floor clear as day. But hers just wasn't there. I thought maybe I was seeing things, tired from the long night and the stress of the situation, so I didn't say anything. But it nagged at me. I tried calling Janet to let her know about the situation, figuring she'd want to know I had customers in the store, but the phone lines were completely dead. The ice storm had probably taken down phone service along with everything else. That wasn't unusual for severe weather in the mountains, so I didn't think much of it at the time. The family helped me stock shelves for a while, and we kept talking. But the more we talked, the more their stories seemed to shift. First, they were from Richmond, then Norfolk, then some small town I'd never heard of. Jim said he worked in construction, then mentioned being an electrician, then something about managing a hardware store. The kids' names even seemed to change. Sarah became Samantha, then back to Sarah again. I started to feel uneasy, like something was fundamentally wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what. They seemed nice enough, grateful for the help, but there was something off about the whole situation that I couldn't shake. Around 4 a.m., I decided to check the security monitors just to see how bad the roads looked, maybe get an idea of when they might be able to leave. The employee break room had a small monitor that showed feeds from the parking lot cameras, and I wanted to see if the ice was starting to melt at all. What I saw on those monitors made my blood freeze. The parking lot cameras showed the ice-covered asphalt completely smooth and undisturbed. There were no footprints in the snow and ice leading to the store entrance. The surface was perfect, like nobody had walked across it in hours. But that was impossible. I'd watched this family come to the door, watched them stumble across that parking lot. I rewound the footage, going back to around 1 a.m. when they'd arrived. On the screen, I watched myself walk to the front doors. I watched myself unlock them and step back, clearly talking to someone. But the camera showed empty space where the family should have been. I was handing blankets to thin air, gesturing toward the break room while talking to nobody. On the security footage, I looked like a crazy person having a conversation with myself. My hands were shaking as I checked the other camera angles, hoping I'd find some explanation, some technical glitch that would make sense of what I was seeing. But every camera told the same story. I'd been alone in the store all night. The family I'd been talking to, the people I'd given coffee and blankets to, the children I'd played cards with, none of them existed, at least not in any way the cameras could detect. I walked back toward the main store on unsteady legs, and they were still there. Still sitting in the break area I'd set up for them, still talking quietly among themselves. But now I noticed things I'd been too distracted to see before. When they moved around, they weren't leaving wet footprints anymore, even though their clothes had been soaked. Sarah was sitting directly under a heating vent, but her hair wasn't moving in the warm air blowing down. "Ashley," Jim said, noticing my expression. "Is everything all right? You look pale." I tried to act normal, but my hands were shaking as I pretended to continue organizing inventory. Every instinct I had was screaming that something was wrong, but I didn't know what to do. If I was having some kind of breakdown, confronting hallucinations didn't seem like the smart move. If they were something else entirely, I didn't want to let on that I knew. "We're so grateful you let us in," Linda said, smiling at me in a way that suddenly seemed too wide, too perfect. Most people wouldn't be so kind to strangers. That's when Sarah started singing. It was a lullaby, something old and sweet, but her voice echoed strangely in the store, like it was coming from further away than where she sat. The melody seemed to bounce off the walls in ways that didn't make sense, and underneath it, I could swear I heard the sound of wind and ice, even though we were inside. Around 5 a.m., I noticed they'd all gone completely still, not just quiet, completely motionless, like someone had pressed pause on them. They were positioned around me in a loose circle, and they were all staring at me with expressions that never changed. Jim's smile was frozen in place. Linda's head tilted at an angle that looked uncomfortable, the kids standing with perfect posture that no real children maintain for more than a few seconds. "What do you want?" I whispered, finally admitting to myself that this wasn't normal, wasn't human. Jim's mouth didn't move, but I heard his voice anyway, like it was coming from inside my head. "Warmth. We've been so cold for so long." That's when I felt it. Heat draining from my body like someone had opened a window in my chest. The air around me got colder with each breath, and I could see my breath fogging now, even though the store's heating was running full blast. Ice started forming on the shelves closest to where the family stood, spreading outward like frost on a window. I ran. Didn't think, didn't plan, just ran for the emergency exit at the back of the store. But when I grabbed the handle, it was frozen solid. The metal was so cold it burned, and my skin stuck to it like I'd grabbed a piece of dry ice. I could hear them moving behind me, their footsteps making wet sounds on the linoleum, but the rhythm was wrong. Too slow, too deliberate. I yanked my hand free, tearing skin off my palm, and kept pulling at the door until it finally opened. The ice storm had passed while I was inside, and I could see the first hints of sunrise breaking through the clouds. The cold air outside felt warm compared to what I'd left behind in the store. I got to my car, which was still covered in ice but not as badly as I'd expected, and managed to get it started. When I looked back at the store, it was completely dark inside. No sign that anyone had been in there, no lights on in the break room, nothing. Janet found me sitting in my car in the parking lot at 6:30 a.m. when she arrived for the opening shift. I was hypothermic and apparently talking nonsense about a family that had never existed. She called an ambulance, and I spent 2 days in the hospital being treated for severe frostbite on my hands and what the doctors politely called exhaustion-induced hallucinations. The security footage backed up their theory. 8 hours of video showing me talking to myself, moving around invisible objects, making coffee for nobody. I looked completely insane, and I couldn't argue with the evidence. But I knew what I'd experienced, even if I couldn't prove it. After I got out of the hospital, I did some research. Turns out the Peterson family, Jim, Linda, Sarah, and Michael, died in a car accident on Route 32 in January 1998. Their car slid off the icy road during a winter storm, and they froze to death in the ditch waiting for help that never came. The newspaper article said they'd been trying to get to the medical center because their son was having an asthma attack. I quit Walmart 2 weeks later and moved to Phoenix. Hot, dry desert where ice storms aren't even possible. I still get cold sweats whenever I walk into an air-conditioned building, and I've never worked a night shift again. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed in my apartment here in Arizona, I wonder if they found someone else to help them get warm. Another night shift worker maybe, someone kind enough to open the door for a family in need. I really hope they didn't. I'm Frank Rodriguez, and I'm 45 years old now. Been hunting these West Virginia mountains for 23 years, ever since my brother-in-law Pete first dragged me out here when I married his sister Maria. Back then, I thought hunting was just an excuse for guys to drink beer in the woods, but honestly, it became something I looked forward to more than Christmas. There's something about being out there in the quiet, away from the construction sites and traffic and all the noise that fills up your head during the week. I work as a foreman for a small contracting company in Charleston, and most days I'm dealing with permits and inspections and crews that show up late. The mountains are where I go to remember what silence sounds like. Pete's been my hunting partner for all these years. Every February, we take 4 days and head up to some remote spot, just the two of us. It started as a way to get along with Maria's family, if I'm being honest. But Pete turned out to be good company. He's one of those guys who knows every logging road and creek in 3 counties, and he's got this way of moving through the woods like he was born there. We've got our routine down to a science. Split up in the morning, meet back at camp for lunch, compare notes about what we've seen. Most years we come home with at least one decent buck between us. And even when we don't, the trip is worth it just for the peace and quiet. This year, Pete had been talking about trying somewhere new. His cousin Danny works for the Forestry Service, and he'd mentioned this area called Silverback Ridge, way up north near the Pennsylvania border. Danny said it was pristine hunting country, no other hunters, no cabins, just miles and miles of untouched forest. The only downside was you couldn't drive all the way in, had to park at an old logging road and hike about 2 miles to find a decent spot to set up camp. Pete was excited about it, kept saying we'd been hunting the same areas for years, and maybe it was time to try something different. Looking back now, I wish we'd just stuck with our usual spots. We left Charleston early on February 18, 2023, in Pete's pickup truck. He'd loaded up his usual camping gear, the big canvas tent that weighs about 50 pounds, his grandmother's old cast-iron cooking set, enough canned food to feed a small army. Pete believes in being prepared, sometimes to a ridiculous degree. I brought my lighter gear and my father's old rifle, a Winchester Model 70 that's never let me down. The drive took about 4 hours, winding through smaller and smaller mountain roads until we were on gravel, then dirt, then finally what was barely a trail at all. The last stretch was rough enough that Pete had to put the truck in 4-wheel drive. We passed a few old homestead sites. stone foundations and rusty farm equipment slowly being swallowed up by the forest. The area felt empty in a way that was different from our usual hunting spots. Not just unpopulated, but like people had given up on it entirely. When we finally reached the end of the road, where Danny had told us to park, there wasn't another vehicle in sight. No tire tracks in the mud, no cigarette butts, no beer cans, nothing to suggest anyone else had been there recently. The hike in was tougher than Pete had expected. The trail was overgrown and hard to follow, and we had to cross 2 creeks that weren't on any of his maps. By the time we found a clearing big enough to set up camp, it was getting dark and we were both exhausted. But I had to admit, the spot was perfect. A natural clearing surrounded by old-growth forest, with a little stream running along one edge. The air was clean and cold, and when we got our fire going, the stars were brighter than I'd seen in years. No light pollution, no airplane noise, just the sound of water running over rocks and wind moving through the trees. Friday night was exactly what we'd been hoping for. We cooked dinner over the fire, shared a couple of beers, and went to sleep early. The temperature dropped into the 20s, but our sleeping bags kept us warm. I remember lying there listening to Pete snore softly and thinking this might be the best hunting trip we'd ever taken. The forest was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Even the usual night sounds, owls, insects, small animals moving around, seemed muted, like the whole mountain was holding its breath. Saturday morning, we were up before dawn, the way we always are on the first real day of hunting. Pete made coffee and bacon while I checked our gear and loaded our rifles. The plan was the same as always: split up after breakfast, cover more ground that way, meet back at camp around noon to compare notes and decide where to focus our afternoon efforts. Pete was going to work the ridgeline to the north, and I'd head east toward what looked like a natural funnel where deer might be moving between feeding areas. The morning started out perfect. Clear sky, cold air, just a light breeze, exactly the kind of weather that makes deer move. I found fresh tracks almost immediately, a decent-sized buck based on the size and spacing. Following the trail took me deeper into the forest than I'd planned, through thick stands of pine and oak that blocked out most of the early sunlight. That's when I started noticing things that didn't quite add up. The tracks I was following weren't the only ones in the snow. There were other footprints, and at first I thought they might be from another hunter, even though Pete and I hadn't seen any other vehicles. But when I looked closer, something was wrong with them. They were huge, maybe size 18 or 20, and the shape was off. Too long, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of each toe. The stride length suggested something over 7 feet tall, which made me think black bear walking upright. Bears do that sometimes, especially when they're trying to get a better view or catch a scent. But then I started noticing other things. Broken branches arranged in what looked like deliberate patterns, geometric shapes that didn't happen naturally. Small stones stacked in little cairns, scratches on tree bark that were too high and too purposeful to be accidental. It looked like territorial marking, but more complex than what any animal I knew about would do. I remember thinking to myself that maybe there was another hunter up here after all, someone who was trying to confuse game trails or mark his territory in some way I didn't understand. Around 10 a.m., I found something that made my stomach drop. A deer carcass, probably the buck I'd been tracking, but it had been killed and butchered with surgical precision. The cuts were clean, almost like they'd been made with medical instruments. Every piece of usable meat had been removed and arranged in neat piles, but then just left there to freeze. No human hunter would waste that much good venison, and no animal I knew about was capable of that kind of precise cutting. The bones looked like they'd been studied, arranged in patterns I couldn't understand. That's when I heard Pete calling for help. His voice was coming from about a quarter-mile away, through thick forest in the direction of the ridgeline. But something was wrong with how it sounded. The echo was off, like his voice was bouncing around in ways that didn't match the terrain. And it seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once, like there were several people calling my name instead of just one. I grabbed my rifle and headed toward the sound, crashing through underbrush and trying to follow what I thought was the most direct route. The forest got thicker as I climbed toward the ridge, and I had to push through tangles of mountain laurel and dead branches that caught at my jacket and pants. Pete's voice kept calling, but it never seemed to get any closer. If anything, it sounded like it was moving away from me, leading me deeper into areas where the trees grew so close together that the ground was bare of snow and nearly dark even in the middle of the day. I started to wonder if I was going in circles. When I finally found Pete, I knew immediately that something was very wrong. He was standing in a small clearing, perfectly still, facing away from me toward something on the far side of the open space. He wasn't responding when I called his name, wasn't even acknowledging that I was there. His rifle was on the ground at his feet, and his whole body was rigid, like he was frozen in place. I followed his line of sight and saw what he was looking at. The thing was maybe 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur, built like a gorilla, but wrong in ways that made my brain hurt to look at it. Its arms were too long, hanging past its knees, and its head was shaped like no animal I'd ever seen. Not quite human, not quite ape, but something that existed in the space between the two. It was standing upright, but its posture was off, like it was mimicking human behavior, but didn't quite understand how it was supposed to work. When the creature turned toward me, I saw its face, and I understood why Pete wasn't moving. It was almost human, but stretched and distorted like a photograph that had been pulled out of shape. Its eyes showed intelligence, not animal instinct, but the kind of awareness that meant it was studying me, analyzing me, trying to figure out what I was and how I worked. When it looked directly at me, I felt something probing at the edges of my thoughts, like fingers riffling through files in my brain. Images flooded my mind, memories that weren't mine, stretching back centuries. The creature's memories, I realized. It had been in these mountains since before the Cherokee, watching human settlements grow and change, learning our behavior patterns and social structures. It understood us better than we understood ourselves, had been studying us for generations like we were insects in a laboratory. It knew how we moved, how we thought, how we reacted to fear and pain and loss. The thing could perfectly mimic human voices, human faces, even human thoughts after studying people long enough. It showed me cave walls covered in detailed drawings, not primitive pictographs, but sophisticated anatomical studies of human behavior spanning hundreds of years. Hunting patterns, family structures, emotional responses, everything that made us human cataloged and analyzed with scientific precision. We study. It spoke directly into my mind without moving its mouth. The voice wasn't sound. It was thoughts being placed in my head, ideas that felt foreign and invasive. We learn. We become. That's when I realized Pete wasn't just hypnotized or paralyzed. The creature was downloading his memories, his personality, his entire sense of self. It was learning to be Pete Rodriguez, studying his mannerisms and speech patterns and emotional responses so it could become a perfect copy. I watched his face go slack as pieces of who he was were being systematically extracted and cataloged. Around the edges of the clearing, I started noticing other figures, people I recognized from town. Old Man Jenkins, who ran the hardware store, Sarah, who waited tables at the diner, even my neighbor Bob, who lived 2 houses down from Maria and me. But they all moved slightly wrong, like actors who had memorized their lines but didn't understand the emotions behind them. Their expressions were too perfect, too practiced, like someone had told them how humans were supposed to look when they were happy or sad or confused. "Your friend will return to your settlement," the creature explained, its thoughts pressing into my mind like cold fingers. "He will be perfect, better than he was before. We have been preparing for expansion." I raised my rifle, more out of instinct than any real plan. But the thing moved faster than anything that size should have been able to move. One moment, it was 20 feet away. The next, it was behind me. One massive hand resting on my shoulder, with just enough pressure to let me know it could crush every bone in my body without effort. "Do not interfere," it continued, its thoughts calm and patient. "We have been preparing for this for a very long time. Your species is ready for improvement." It released me, and I ran. I crashed through the forest toward our campsite, branches tearing at my clothes and face, my lungs burning from the cold air and panic. Behind me, I could hear Pete's voice saying goodbye to the creature, thanking it for its hospitality in a tone that was perfectly Pete, but somehow completely wrong. By the time I reached our clearing, Pete was already there, calmly packing up our gear. "Change of plans, Frank," he said cheerfully, looking up from stuffing his sleeping bag into its compression sack. "Let's head home early. Maria's been texting. There's some family thing she wants us to be back for." But Pete's phone had been dead since we'd arrived. No signal up here, and he'd forgotten his charger anyway. And Maria never texted during hunting trips. She knew we came up here to get away from all that. I stared at the thing that looked like Pete, moved like Pete, sounded exactly like Pete, but wasn't Pete at all. "Everything okay?" it asked, and the concern in its voice was perfect. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The drive home was the longest 4 hours of my life. The Pete thing made conversation exactly the way Pete always did, complaining about the road conditions, talking about work, asking about my latest construction projects. It knew everything Pete should know, told the same stories, laughed at the same jokes, but its eyes were different, too observant, too calculating, like it was cataloging every detail of our interaction for future reference. When we got back to Charleston, it moved in with my sister, like nothing had changed. Maria didn't notice anything wrong. Why would she? To her, Pete had gone hunting with her brother and come back the same as always. Maybe a little quieter, maybe a little more attentive, but those seemed like improvements, if anything. I tried to tell her something was wrong, but what was I supposed to say? That her husband had been replaced by some kind of shape-shifting creature that lived in the mountains? That the man she was sleeping next to every night was an alien intelligence that had been studying human behavior for centuries? 6 months later, 3 more people in town started acting slightly different after taking camping trips in the mountains. Different, but better in small ways that no one questioned. Mike from the auto shop became more patient with difficult customers. Jennifer from the bank started volunteering at the animal shelter. Small improvements that made them better versions of themselves. But to me, they all had the same too observant look in their eyes. The real Pete is probably still up on Silverback Ridge, being studied in whatever cave or laboratory the creatures use for their research. Part of me wonders if he's still alive, if they need to keep their subjects intact to continue learning from them, or if they just extract what they need and dispose of what's left. I've thought about going back, maybe bringing some other hunters, maybe contacting the authorities. But what evidence do I have? A creature that can perfectly mimic human behavior isn't going to leave witnesses or physical proof. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the only real person left in town, or if that creature and others like it have been replacing us for years, decades maybe, without anyone noticing the difference. How would we know? If they're perfect copies, if they're actually improvements on the originals, what's the harm? Maybe what happened to Pete is evolution, the next step forward for humanity. But then I look at Maria, and I see how happy she is with her improved husband, and I know that something essential has been lost. The real Pete had flaws. He was stubborn and sometimes selfish, and he left dirty dishes in the sink, but those flaws were part of who he was, part of what made him human. The thing that replaced him is perfect in all the wrong ways. I still live in Charleston, still work construction, but I don't hunt anymore. Maria thinks it's because of what happened to Pete on that trip, some kind of trauma I won't talk about. She's not wrong, but she doesn't understand what really happened. Sometimes at family gatherings, I catch the Pete thing watching me, and I know it's wondering if I'm going to be a problem, if I'm going to try to expose what it really is. So far, I've kept quiet, but I'm getting older, and sometimes I think about what happens when I die, when there's no one left who remembers the real Pete Rodriguez. Will anyone know the difference? Will it matter? I guess that's what scares me most. Not that they're replacing us, but that maybe we won't even miss what we've lost. I'm 19 years old, and I run a YouTube channel called Forgotten Appalachia, where I explore abandoned places throughout the mountains. Started it my junior year of high school when I was documenting old homesteads around my hometown in eastern Kentucky, and somehow it blew up to about 50,000 subscribers who love seeing the creepy old buildings and ghost towns scattered through these hills. Most of my content is pretty tame. Rusted out mining equipment, collapsed barns, maybe the occasional cemetery with headstones from the 1800s. My viewers eat that stuff up, especially when I film during bad weather for the atmospheric shots. Looking back now, I should have stuck to surface-level exploring instead of always pushing deeper into places that were sealed off for good reasons. The whole thing with frost mines started back in February 2023 when my friend Kayla mentioned it during one of our weekend drives through the back roads. Kayla's lived in these mountains her whole life. Her family's been here since before the coal companies moved in, so she knows all the local stories and abandoned sites that don't show up on any official maps. We were heading back from filming an old logging camp when she pointed to a ridge about 20 miles deeper into the mountains and said her grandfather used to work at a mine up there that shut down real sudden-like in 1982. Frost Mine, she called it, though she wasn't sure if that was the official name or just what folks called it on account of how cold it stayed up there year-round. According to her grandfather, the operation was pulling decent coal right up until some kind of accident happened deep in the tunnels. He never talked much about what exactly went wrong, but Kayla said the company sealed everything up practically overnight and moved their equipment to other sites. The workers all got transferred or laid off, and within 6 months it was like the place never existed, except for the locals who remembered the stories about strange sounds coming from the sealed mine entrances during winter storms. That was exactly the kind of content my subscribers loved, so we started planning a trip up there for the next big snowstorm. Kayla's dad let us borrow his truck since my little Honda wasn't going to make it up those mountain roads in bad weather, and we loaded it up with camera equipment, extra batteries, and enough supplies for a full day of exploring. The weather forecast was calling for a major blizzard to hit eastern Kentucky that weekend, which would give us perfect atmospheric conditions for filming. We should have paid more attention to why none of the older locals wanted to talk about frost mine when we asked around town. Most just shook their heads and changed the subject, but Mrs. Henderson down at the general store actually grabbed my arm when I mentioned where we were heading and told me some places were sealed up for reasons that had nothing to do with safety regulations. I figured she was just being superstitious. Mountain folk have stories about every old mine and abandoned building around here. Hell, half my video views come from people who love that kind of local folklore mixed in with the urban exploration footage. The morning we headed up to Frost Mine, the snow was already coming down hard and the temperature had dropped to about 15 degrees. Kayla picked me up around dawn in her dad's truck, and we spent 3 hours navigating increasingly narrow mountain roads that barely qualified as more than deer trails. The GPS lost signal about halfway up, but Kayla knew the area well enough to follow old logging roads that eventually led us to what used to be the main access road for the mining operation. When we finally reached the site, I understood why the place felt so isolated and forgotten. The mine complex was massive, way bigger than I'd expected from Kayla's description. Rusted conveyor systems stretched across the hillside like giant metal skeletons, and there were at least a dozen buildings in various stages of collapse scattered around the main staging area. Most of the structures had sheet metal roofs that had buckled under decades of heavy snow, but a few concrete buildings looked like they might still be intact enough to explore safely. We parked the truck near what looked like the old administrative building and started unloading our camera gear. The snow was falling so thick we could barely see 50 feet in any direction, which actually worked perfectly for the kind of atmospheric footage my viewers expected. I set up my main camera on a tripod and started filming establishing shots of the abandoned equipment while Kayla scouted around for the safest buildings to enter. The first couple hours went exactly like every other abandoned site exploration I'd done. We found the typical stuff: old office furniture covered in years of dust, calendars still hanging on walls showing dates from 1982, filing cabinets with drawers pulled open like someone had been searching for important documents in a hurry. The mining company had cleared out most of the valuable equipment, but they'd left behind enough paperwork and personal items to give us plenty of material for the video. Everything felt normal until we made our way to what Kayla figured was the mine supervisor's office, a concrete building that had weathered better than the rest. The door was unlocked, probably hadn't been secured properly when they evacuated, and inside we found something I'd never seen at any other abandoned site. The walls were covered with detailed mining charts and tunnel maps that showed the underground layout of the entire operation. Most mining sites I'd explored had been stripped clean of that kind of technical documentation, but whoever shut down Frost Mine had left everything exactly where it was. The maps were fascinating from a historical perspective, showing tunnel systems that extended way deeper underground than I would have expected for a coal operation this size. Some of the shafts went down over 400 feet, with lateral tunnels spreading out like a spider web under the entire mountain. But what really caught our attention was one section of the map where someone had drawn a thick red circle around a cluster of tunnels and written "Do not dig, sealed by order," in block letters across the whole area. Kayla found a stack of mining logs on the supervisor's desk that were even more interesting than the maps. The entries started normal enough: daily production reports, equipment maintenance notes, worker schedules. But as we got closer to the final entries from early 1982, the tone started getting weird. Workers were reporting strange acoustic phenomena coming from the deeper tunnels, describing it as singing or humming that seemed to echo up from sections where no one was supposed to be working. The supervisor had documented several complaints about the sounds, initially dismissing them as normal settling or air movement through the tunnels. But the reports kept coming, and by January 1982, He was taking them seriously enough to send investigation teams down to check the source. That's when things got really strange, according to the final log entry we found. On February 18, 1982, a crew following the sounds had broken through a section of tunnel wall into what the supervisor described as a natural cavern of significant size. His handwriting got shakier as the entry continued, describing stone structures and carved symbols that the workers found inside the cavern. The final line, written in different ink like he'd come back to add it later, simply said, "Not built by humans. Seal everything immediately." After that, there were no more log entries, just empty pages in a logbook that should have contained months of additional reports. Whatever they found down there had been enough to shut down a profitable mining operation practically overnight, which made absolutely no sense from a business perspective. Coal companies don't walk away from productive sites because workers hear weird noises or find some old Indian carvings in a cave. But it was perfect content for my channel. We decided to find the sealed entrance and get some footage of whatever had spooked the miners badly enough to abandon the whole operation. Using the maps from the supervisor's office, we hiked through the deepening snow to a hillside on the far side of the complex where the main shaft entrances should have been located. The snow was coming down so hard by then that we were basically following compass bearings and hoping we'd recognize the right area when we found it. The sealed mine entrances weren't hard to spot once we got close enough. Someone had poured concrete barriers across what looked like 3 separate tunnel openings, creating walls that were supposed to permanently block access to the underground workings. But 40 years of freeze-thaw cycles had cracked the concrete, and we could feel warm air flowing out through gaps in the barriers, which was weird, considering how cold it was on the surface. Kayla squeezed through the largest crack first, using her phone's flashlight to check that the tunnel beyond was stable enough for us to enter safely. I followed with my camera equipment, though I had to leave some of the heavier gear outside since the opening was barely wide enough for one person at a time. The tunnel beyond the barrier sloped downward at a steep angle, with support timbers that looked solid enough despite their age. About 200 feet into the tunnel, we found where the 1982 mining crew had broken through into the natural cavern the supervisor had described in his final log entry. The opening was maybe 6 feet wide and tall enough for us to walk through without ducking, leading into a space so large our flashlight beams couldn't reach the far walls. As soon as we stepped inside, I knew we'd found something genuinely strange. The cavern was massive, probably the size of a cathedral, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above our heads. But what made it really unsettling were the structures the miners had discovered. Stone pillars, each about 8 feet tall and carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. The symbols weren't like anything I'd ever seen before, not Native American petroglyphs or any kind of historical markings I could recognize. They seemed to move on their own, rearranging themselves into new patterns every time I glanced away and looked back. In the center of the cavern was a circular pit, maybe 20 feet across, filled with water so black it didn't reflect our flashlight beams at all. The water should have been frozen solid in this temperature, but it was perfectly liquid, with small ripples spreading outward from the center like something was moving underneath the surface. When Kayla pointed her light toward the water, we could both see the ripples getting bigger, as if whatever was down there had noticed our presence. That's when we started hearing the singing. Not human voices, something that made our teeth ache and sent vibrations through our chest cavities like standing too close to massive subwoofers. The sound was coming from the black water, rising and falling in patterns that almost sounded like a twisted lullaby. My camera started malfunctioning as soon as the singing began, showing strange geometric shapes and impossible angles on the LCD screen instead of what we were actually looking at. Something was emerging from the pit, not climbing out like a normal creature would, but flowing upward like liquid smoke. The thing was completely black and kept shifting between different forms, sometimes looking like smoke, sometimes like oil, sometimes like shadow-given substance. But occasionally, when the light hit it just right, I could see structures inside it, tiny buildings, entire cities, whole civilizations existing in miniature within whatever this thing was. It spoke to us without making any sound, projecting thoughts directly into our minds in a way that felt like ice picks being driven through our skulls. The images it showed us were of Earth before humans existed, when things like itself ruled from vast underground cities. The coal miners had accidentally broken into what amounted to a prison chamber, disturbing something that had been hibernating for millions of years. The thoughts it sent us were simple and terrifying. Feed, grow, reclaim. The entity began reaching toward us with tendrils that left frost patterns in the air wherever they passed. Everything those tendrils touched aged rapidly, stone crumbling to dust, metal rusting through in seconds, life draining away like water down a sink. I grabbed Kayla's arm and we ran for the tunnel entrance, but the cavern was changing around us. The walls were expanding, growing larger, like we were inside something's throat that was slowly swallowing. Behind us, the entity's singing became a roar that shook rocks loose from the ceiling and made the stone pillars crack and lean at impossible angles. We made it to the tunnel just as chunks of the cavern roof started falling and kept running until we reached the concrete barrier. The warm air that had been flowing from the tunnel earlier was gone, replaced by a cold so intense it burned our lungs with every breath. We squeezed through the crack in the barrier and found ourselves back in the blizzard, which somehow felt tropical compared to the supernatural cold we'd just escaped. As we stumbled back toward the truck, the entire hillside collapsed behind us. Not gradually, like a normal cave-in, but all at once, as if something massive had pulled the mountain down from underneath. The mine entrance was completely gone, buried under tons of rock and snow. When I checked my camera footage later, hoping to have some evidence of what we'd experienced, the files showed nothing but static and the same geometric patterns we'd seen on the LCD screen during the encounter. Kayla developed severe frostbite on both hands where she'd touched the tunnel walls, despite wearing heavy gloves the entire time. Worse, the symbols we'd seen on the cavern walls had appeared burned into her skin like tattoos, faint but clearly visible. I spent weeks researching the history of coal mining in eastern Kentucky, looking for other incidents similar to what had happened at Frost Mine. What I found was a pattern of operations shutting down suddenly after breaking into natural caverns, always with vague references to structural instability or geological concerns in the official reports. But when I tracked down relatives of miners who'd worked at those sites, they told stories remarkably similar to ours. Underground chambers with carved symbols, black water that didn't freeze, and sounds that came from places where no living thing should exist. My YouTube channel got shut down about a month after I tried uploading what little footage had survived from Frost Mine. The platform claimed it violated their community guidelines for disturbing content, even though I'd uploaded far more graphic exploration videos before without any problems. When I appealed the decision, they told me the content had been flagged for containing artificially generated or manipulated media, which made no sense since the static and geometric patterns were obviously corrupted file data, not special effects. Kayla moved to Oregon a few weeks after our trip to Frost Mine and won't return my calls or messages. I can't blame her. The symbols on her hands have faded but never completely disappeared, and she told me before she left that she was having nightmares about black water and singing that made her teeth hurt. Sometimes I wonder if the entity marked both of us somehow, and she just got out of the mountains before whatever it planted in our minds could take root. I still live in eastern Kentucky, but I've stopped exploring abandoned sites completely. Every time there's a major winter storm, I find myself thinking about that black pit and wondering if the cave-in really sealed the entity away, or just gave it time to find another way to the surface. The dreams started about 6 months ago. Images of that underground chamber, but bigger now, expanding like a cancer through the mountain's root system. In the dreams, I can hear the singing getting closer, and sometimes I wake up with the taste of coal dust in my mouth even though I haven't been near a mine in over a year. I think we didn't stumble into that thing's prison by accident. I think it wanted us to find it, wanted someone to know it was still down there waiting for the right conditions to break free. Now something ancient and hungry knows there are humans on the surface again, and I have the feeling that the next big winter storm that cracks the mountain just right is going to release more than just an entity that's been sleeping since before our ancestors walked upright. I'm starting to think we woke up something that's been preparing for this moment for a very, very long time. I'm 24 years old and work the late shift delivering pizza for Tony's in Millfield, West Virginia. It's not glamorous work, but it pays my tuition at the community college where I'm studying computer science. Most nights, I'm cruising around campus delivering to drunk students who tip in crumpled singles, but that's fine by me. I grew up about 30 minutes outside town on my family's old farmland, so I know these mountain roads like the back of my hand. Been driving them since I was 15, helping my dad haul equipment and supplies up to the logging sites. The money from Tony's keeps me in school and helps my mom with the mortgage since Dad's been laid up with his back injury. Honestly, I don't mind the work. There's something peaceful about driving the empty mountain roads at night, just me and my Honda Civic with its surprisingly good tires. I've been doing this job for almost 2 years now, and I've seen just about everything you can imagine on a pizza delivery route. But what happened during the February snowstorm of 2021 still keeps me up at night sometimes. February 20th started normal enough. I had classes until 4, then headed straight to Tony's for my shift. The weather forecast had been calling for snow all week, but nobody expected what we got. By 6 p.m., it was coming down hard, the kind of snow that makes you question whether you should be driving at all. Most of the other drivers called out sick, which honestly wasn't surprising. These college kids from out of state panic when they see more than an inch of powder. But I needed the money. My mom's medical bills had been piling up since her diabetes diagnosis, and every shift I missed was groceries we couldn't buy or medication we'd have to put off. Tony looked relieved when I showed up, probably figuring he'd be stuck making deliveries himself in his beat-up Corolla. The first few runs were typical storm deliveries, dormitories and apartment complexes close to campus where kids were too scared or too lazy to venture out for food. Tips were good, which they always are during bad weather. People feel guilty making you drive in conditions like that, so they usually throw in an extra 5 or 10. By 9:30, the snow was really picking up. I'd been listening to the radio between deliveries, and the weather service was calling it the worst storm in 2 decades. The interstate was already shut down, and they were advising everyone to stay off the roads unless it was an emergency. I was getting ready to suggest Tony close early when the phone rang. He answered with his usual gruff, "Tony's Pizza," then spent a few minutes taking down an order. When he hung up, he looked confused. "Got a delivery for Silent Hollow," he said, checking the address he'd written down. 1247 Hollow Road. That's way up in the mountains. I knew the area vaguely. Silent Hollow was about 15 miles outside town, up where the old logging roads branch off into the national forest. Service cuts out up there, and in weather like this, it would be a treacherous drive. But the customer had paid by credit card and left a $50 tip, which was more than I usually made in tips for an entire shift. "I'll take it," I said. Tony raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He probably figured if anyone could make it up there, it would be the local kid who'd been driving these roads his whole life. The drive started normal enough. Highway 19 was still passable, though I had to take it slow. My Honda handled better in snow than you'd expect. Dad had taught me to keep good tires on it, and I'd learned how to read black ice and navigate steep grades during my years helping with the logging operation. The snowfall was hypnotic in my headlights, and I had the heat cranked up, classic rock playing softly on the radio. For the first 10 miles or so, I passed a few other vehicles, mostly trucks with snowplows or four-wheel drive. But as I turned off onto Hollow Road, civilization disappeared. The trees closed in on both sides, their heavy branches creating a tunnel effect that blocked most of the falling snow. My GPS signal started cutting in and out, which wasn't unusual for this area. The road climbed steadily through switchbacks and hairpin turns that would be challenging in good weather, let alone during a blizzard. I'd driven logging roads steeper than this, but never in conditions quite this bad. About 20 minutes in, something felt off. The snow on the road looked different somehow, not fresh powder, but almost like it had been swept or packed down. My tire tracks weren't the only ones, but the others looked odd. Too narrow for a truck, too wide for a normal car. And there was something else bothering me that I couldn't quite put my finger on until I realized what it was. Complete silence. Even with my windows up and the radio on, you can usually hear the storm outside, wind through the trees, the soft impact of snow hitting the windshield. But it was like driving through a vacuum. The radio started cutting out around the 30-minute mark, which wasn't surprising given how deep into the mountains I was getting. What was weird was the way it cut out. Not the usual static and fade you get when you lose signal, but sudden, complete silence, like someone had hit a mute button. I tried adjusting the dial but got nothing. Even the CD player seemed sluggish when I tried to switch over. When my GPS finally gave up entirely, I started to worry I'd taken a wrong turn. But the road kept climbing, and I could see faint tire tracks in the snow ahead of me, so I figured I was still on the right path. The trees were getting thicker, older looking. These weren't the second-growth forest you see most places in West Virginia. These were massive oaks and maples that had probably been here since before the logging companies came through in the 1920s. Then I saw the lights. At first, it was just a warm yellow glow, filtering through the trees ahead. As I came around the next bend, I could make out the shape of a small cabin set back from the road about 50 yards. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and there were electric lights visible in the windows, which was strange because I couldn't see any power lines running back here. But there was a mailbox by the road with 1247 painted on it in neat white numerals, so I figured this had to be the place. I pulled into the gravel driveway, which was surprisingly clear of snow. The cabin looked well-maintained but old, probably built sometime in the 1950s or 60s, with that distinctive mountain architecture of stone foundation and cedar siding. There was a front porch with 2 rocking chairs and a welcome mat that looked like it had seen better days. Warm light spilled from the windows, and I could see curtains moving slightly, like someone had been watching for me. I grabbed the pizza from the thermal bag and trudged through the snow toward the front door. It was deeper than I'd expected, up to my knees in some places. but the path to the porch had been recently shoveled. I was stamping snow off my boots when the door opened before I could knock. The man who answered was exactly what you'd expect from an elderly mountain resident, maybe 70 years old, wearing a thick cardigan sweater over a flannel shirt, with wire-rimmed glasses and kind eyes. He was thin but not frail, with calloused hands that suggested a lifetime of physical work. "Pizza delivery," I said, holding up the thermal bag. He smiled warmly. "Right on time. Come in out of that cold, son. Terrible night to be driving." I usually don't go inside customers' houses, but the man seemed harmless enough, and honestly, I was freezing. The warmth hit me as soon as I stepped through the doorway. The cabin was small but cozy, with a stone fireplace crackling at one end and handmade furniture that looked like it had been built to last. An elderly woman was sitting in a rocking chair by the fire, knitting what looked like a scarf or blanket. She looked up when I entered and smiled the same warm, welcoming smile. "Oh, good. He made it through the storm," she said, setting down her knitting. "I told Harold we should have offered to meet him at the bottom of the mountain, but he insisted you young folks were tougher than we gave you credit for." The man, Harold, apparently, chuckled. "Martha's been worrying about you since we placed the order. Said no pizza was worth making someone drive in weather like this." I set the pizza box on their kitchen table and started to give them the total, but Martha was already bustling around, insisting I sit down and warm up before heading back out. She had a pot of hot chocolate on the stove that smelled like cinnamon and vanilla, and before I could protest, she was pressing a mug into my hands. "Drink up," she said. "You look half frozen." They were right. I was colder than I'd realized. The hot chocolate was perfect, rich and warming, with just the right amount of sweetness. Harold sat down across from me and started asking about school, my family, what I was studying. They had that genuine interest that you sometimes get from older folks, like they really wanted to know about your life. Martha kept fussing around, making sure I had enough hot chocolate, asking if I was hungry for something more substantial than just pizza. We talked for maybe 20 minutes while I warmed up by their fire. They told me they'd lived in Silent Hollow for most of their married life, that Harold had worked for the Forestry Service before retiring. Martha had been a teacher at the elementary school in town until budget cuts forced her out. They had that easy, comfortable way of talking that comes from 50 years of marriage, finishing each other's sentences and sharing private jokes. When I finally said I needed to get going, Harold insisted on paying in cash rather than the credit card. He handed me $60, exact change for the pizza plus a $20 tip on top of the $50 they'd already left. Martha disappeared into the kitchen and came back with a thermos. "Hot chocolate for the road," she said, pressing it into my hands. "Drive carefully now. These roads can be treacherous at night." The drive back down the mountain was easier than I'd expected. The snow had stopped falling, and the road seemed clearer somehow, like a plow had been through, even though I hadn't seen one. My radio came back to life as soon as I hit the main road, and I made it back to Tony's just before midnight. I was counting my tips when Tony asked how the delivery went. "Great," I said. "Nice elderly couple. Really generous tippers. 1247 Hollow Road, right?" Tony frowned, pulling up something on his computer. "That's weird. I can't find that address in our delivery system." He clicked through several screens, checking our customer database and the credit card records. There was no record of the order anywhere in the system. No credit card charge, no customer information, nothing. "Maybe it was a phone order you forgot to log," I suggested, but Tony shook his head. "I always log the credit cards immediately. Has to be done for the payment to process." The cash they'd given me was real enough, though. I counted it twice to make sure, $60, just like they'd said. Old bills, but crisp and clean, like they'd been stored carefully for years. I didn't think much more about it until the next day. I was feeling guilty about taking their generous tip without properly thanking them, so I decided to drive back up to Silent Hollow. My girlfriend had made a batch of chocolate chip cookies the night before, and I figured I'd bring them a tin as a thank you gesture. It seemed like the kind of thing Harold and Martha would appreciate. But when I reached the area where their cabin should have been, I found only empty forest. No house, no driveway, no mailbox, nothing but old-growth trees and underbrush that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. I checked my GPS history to make sure I was in the right location. I was. The coordinates matched exactly where I'd been the night before, but there was no sign that anyone had ever lived there. I spent an hour walking around the area, looking for any trace of the cabin. Foundation stones, a cleared lot, anything that would indicate human habitation. The trees were massive, the kind that take 50 or 60 years to reach that size. If there had ever been a cabin there, it would have been cleared decades ago. I drove into town and asked around at the gas stations and convenience stores. Nobody had heard of 1247 Hollow Road. The county clerk's office confirmed what I was starting to suspect. Hollow Road only went up to number 800. There was no 1247. A week later, I was telling this story to my grandmother, thinking maybe she'd have some explanation. She'd lived in the area her whole life and knew all the local history and folklore. But when I described Harold and Martha, her face went white. "Harold and Martha Chen," she said quietly. "Oh, honey, they died years ago." She told me the story. Harold and Martha Chen had lived in a small cabin in Silent Hollow back in the 1990s. Harold worked for the Forestry Service, just like he'd told me. Martha had been a teacher. They'd been known throughout the county as good people, the kind who'd help anyone who needed it, especially young folks who were struggling. They died during the blizzard of 1995. A tree fell across their driveway during the storm, trapping them in their cabin. By the time neighbors realized they hadn't been seen for several days, it was too late. They'd frozen to death waiting for help that never came. The cabin was demolished after their deaths. The land reverted to state forest, and over the years, the trees grew back over where their home had been. But according to my grandmother, delivery drivers and lost travelers still reported being helped by an elderly couple during bad weather in Silent Hollow. Always the same story: a warm cabin, hot chocolate, generous payment, and safe passage home. The reports had been coming in for 25 years. Tony started getting phantom orders for Silent Hollow every winter after that. Different drivers would take the calls, but they always found the same kind couple. After the third or fourth time, we stopped questioning it. The cash was always real, the customers were always grateful, and nobody ever got hurt. We just started considering it a blessing. Someone looking out for pizza drivers who had to work dangerous shifts during storms. I graduated college 2 years later and got a job with a tech company in Charleston. Good salary, benefits, the kind of stable career my parents had always wanted for me. But I still fill in at Tony's during winter storms, not for the money, but hoping I might get another delivery to Silent Hollow. I kept the thermos Martha gave me that night. It still smells faintly of cinnamon and vanilla when you open it. Sometimes when the snow gets bad and I'm driving the mountain roads, I take it with me filled with hot chocolate. If I see a stranded driver or someone who looks like they need help, I stop and offer them a cup. Because maybe that's how you honor the good ghosts, by being good yourself. Harold and Martha Chen never hurt anyone. They just wanted to help young people get home safely. In a world full of scary stories, sometimes the dead ones just want to do something good. Some winter nights, when the snow is falling hard and I'm driving past Silent Hollow, I still watch for their lights in the windows, hoping to see them one more time, hoping to say thank you properly for the kindness they showed a cold, tired kid who just needed to get home. I'm 31 years old, and I drive Snowplow for the county road department here in eastern Kentucky. Been doing this job for 8 years now, ever since I got out of the Army and needed steady work. My name's Marcus Thompson, and I know every back road and mountain pass in these parts like the back of my hand. It's honest work, even if the pay ain't great, and I like being out there by myself most of the time. My wife Sarah always said I was better with machines than people anyway. We got a little house just outside Hazard, nothing fancy, but it's ours. The work keeps me busy through the winter months, which is when we need the overtime most. I've been thinking about maybe getting into something else. Sarah's pregnant with our first due this summer, but for now, the plow route pays the bills. Looking back now, I should have listened when the older guys at the depot talked about certain roads you just don't work alone. Should have paid attention to why nobody wanted the Blood Moon Valley route during heavy storms. The job itself is pretty straightforward most of the time. You get your assignment, fire up the truck, and spend the night pushing snow off mountain roads so folks can get to work the next morning. I actually enjoyed the solitude of it. Just me, the radio, and miles of empty road. The truck was a 2018 Kenworth with a 12-foot blade, reliable as anything, and I kept emergency supplies in the cab. Flares, first aid kit, blankets, MREs, the works. My supervisor, Danny Rodriguez, had been doing county snow removal for 15 years, and he taught me to always be prepared for anything. Out there in them mountains, he'd say, you might be the only help somebody sees for hours. I took that seriously, kept my EMT certification current from my Army days, carried extra radio batteries, made sure my GPS was always charged. The other drivers ribbed me about being over-prepared, but I figured better safe than sorry. Route 441 through Blood Moon Valley was about 40 miles of winding mountain road that connected two small communities, Millfield and Cedar Rock. Mostly just local traffic, maybe a logging truck here and there during good weather. The road itself wasn't particularly dangerous, just long and isolated, cutting through some of the most remote country in the region. I'd driven it plenty of times during regular shifts, knew every curve and steep grade. The valley got its name from some old Cherokee legend about blood on snow, though nobody I talked to knew the whole story. What I did know was that cell service was spotty at best, and once you committed to the route, you were on your own until you reached the other end. The nearest backup was at least an hour away on a good night, assuming they could even get through whatever weather you were dealing with. February 14th, 2023, we got hit with the worst blizzard anyone had seen in 20 years. The Weather Service said 3 feet in 6 hours, but by the time I started my shift at 11 p.m., it was already looking like more than that. The snow was coming down so thick and fast that the plows couldn't keep up. Danny assigned me to Blood Moon Valley for the overnight shift, said it was priority since both communities needed access for emergency services. I remember thinking it was fitting, working Valentine's Day night while Sarah was home watching movies. She'd packed me extra coffee and some of those hand warmers, told me to be careful and call when I could. I promised I'd be home before she woke up. The first hour or so went fine. Snow was heavy, but the truck handled it no problem. I had my playlist going, heater cranked up, just settling into the rhythm of the work. The headlights cut through the snow okay at lower speeds, and I was making steady progress. Radio chatter was minimal. Most of the other drivers were dealing with their own routes. and dispatch was busy coordinating emergency calls. Around midnight, I passed the old logging road that marked the halfway point through the valley. That's when the snow really started coming down harder, thick, wet flakes that stuck to everything and cut visibility down to maybe 10 feet. I had to slow way down, barely crawling along at 15 miles per hour, following the guardrails more than the actual road. About 2 hours into the route, I came around Devil's Curve, this sharp S-turn that drops down toward Blood Moon Creek, and I saw something that made me slam on the brakes. There were cars scattered across the road, dozens of them, twisted metal and shattered glass everywhere. Some were flipped completely over, others wrapped around trees or crumpled against the guardrail. Steam was rising from hot engines in the cold air, and fresh snow was already starting to accumulate on the wreckage. My first thought was that I'd somehow missed hearing about a massive pileup on the radio. 20 vehicles, maybe more, all tangled together in what looked like the worst accident I'd ever seen. I grabbed my radio to call for emergency services, but all I got was static. Tried different channels, checked my connections, nothing. Must have been the storm interfering with the signal. I pulled my truck over as far as I could, hit the emergency flashers, and grabbed my first aid kit. Whatever had happened here, people needed help, and I was the only one around to give it. The snow was already ankle-deep and still falling hard as I ran toward the nearest vehicle, a blue sedan that had slid sideways into a snowbank. Inside the car was a young woman, maybe mid-20s, conscious but bleeding from a gash on her forehead. She was struggling with her seatbelt, looking dazed and confused. When she saw me, relief flooded her face. "Thank God you're here," she said, her voice shaky. "The accident just happened. There are people trapped in other cars. Please, you have to help them." I could see her breath in the cold air, and her hands were shaking as I helped her out of the seatbelt. The cut on her head looked worse than it probably was. Head wounds always bleed a lot, but she seemed alert and responsive. I moved from vehicle to vehicle, finding survivors in most of them. There was an elderly couple in a pickup truck, the man with what looked like a broken arm, his wife with bruises across her face but talking coherently. A family with 2 small kids in a minivan, everyone crying but moving around okay. Young adults in a Honda with a cracked windshield, complaining about neck pain but able to walk. Everyone had the same story. They'd hit black ice coming around the curve, lost control, and couldn't stop before slamming into the cars ahead of them. Made sense, given the weather conditions and how treacherous that particular stretch could be. For 3 hours, I worked my way through the wreckage, using everything I'd learned in EMT training to assess injuries and stabilize the worst cases. Improvised bandages from torn clothing, used my emergency blankets to treat for shock, moved people away from vehicles that might have fuel leaks. The whole time I kept trying my radio, but couldn't get anything but static. My cell phone showed no signal either, which wasn't unusual for this part of the valley, but it was frustrating as hell knowing these people needed ambulances and I couldn't call for them. The strange thing was how cooperative everyone was. No panic, no screaming, just quiet conversations and people following my instructions perfectly. In my experience, accident scenes are usually chaos, people in shock, others freaking out, somebody always trying to move when they shouldn't. But this group was different. Calm, patient, like they were used to waiting. I told myself they were probably all in shock, that the adrenaline would wear off soon, and then they'd start feeling their injuries more. Better to get everyone stabilized while they were still able to function. Around 5 a.m., I pulled the last survivor out of a black pickup truck that had rolled twice before coming to rest against a tree. Middle-aged guy with what looked like a dislocated shoulder. but he was walking and talking fine. I turned around to organize everyone for evacuation, thinking I'd have to make multiple trips to get them all out to the main highway where ambulances could reach them. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Nobody was bleeding anymore. The woman from the first car walked up to me, and the gash on her forehead was completely gone. Not healed, gone, like it had never existed. Her skin was perfect, pale and smooth in the truck's headlights. "You did such good work tonight, Marcus," she said, smiling with teeth that looked too sharp in the dim light. "You saved all of us." I hadn't told anyone my name. It wasn't on my uniform, wasn't written anywhere on the truck. But she knew. I looked around at all the people I'd spent the last 3 hours helping, and they were all watching me with identical expressions. Predatory grins. Their clothes weren't torn anymore. Their bruises had vanished, and their eyes reflected the light like animals. The old man with the broken arm was flexing his fingers normally, no sign of injury. The kids in the minivan were standing perfectly still, their heads tilted at angles that made my neck hurt just looking at them. "We've been waiting here for so long," the old man said, his voice carrying farther than it should have in the heavy snow. "Waiting for someone kind enough to help." I backed toward my plow truck, but when I reached for the door handle, I realized the keys weren't in the ignition where I'd left them. My heart started pounding as I patted my pockets, came up empty. "Every winter storm, we get hungrier," one of the little girls explained, tilting her head at an angle that would have snapped a normal person's neck. "Good people stop to help, and we feed on their kindness, their warmth, their life force." She spoke like an adult, no trace of the crying child I'd comforted an hour earlier. The accident scene was changing around me. The cars looked older now, rusted and covered in decades of snow and ice instead of fresh powder. I could see skeletons behind broken windshields, bones picked clean and scattered through rotting upholstery. Metal corroded by years of mountain weather. Windshields spider-webbed with age, not impact. "This accident happened in 1974, the woman said, stepping closer. Her feet didn't sink into the snow the way mine did. "We've been harvesting helpers ever since." The others started moving toward me, but not like people. Their joints bent in the wrong directions, heads rotating too far around, arms stretching longer than they should have been able to reach. I fumbled in my emergency kit and found a road flare, yanked the cap off and struck it. The bright red light revealed the true scene around me. Dozens of plow trucks, ambulances, and police cars buried in the snow. Some so old they were just rusted frames. Every rescue worker who'd stopped to help over the past 50 years, I realized. Their bones probably mixed in with the others. The things that had been pretending to be accident victims recoiled from the flare light, making sounds like wounded animals, high-pitched shrieking that hurt my ears and seemed to come from everywhere at once. I ran into the tree line, crashing through snow that came up to my knees, following the power lines I could barely see toward what I hoped was the main highway. Behind me, I could hear them laughing and calling my name in voices that sounded like everyone I'd ever cared about. "Marcus, come back. We're still hurt. We need your help." Sarah's voice, my mother's voice, my old army buddies. But I kept running, holding that flare high, the only light in a world that had gone completely dark. I made it to Route 80 just as the sun was coming up, flagged down a state trooper who was heading back from an emergency call, told him everything, the whole impossible story. He listened without interrupting, then drove me back to investigate. When we reached Blood Moon Valley, it was empty except for old rusted car frames half buried in snowdrifts, metal so corroded it looked like it had been there for decades. Everyone knows not to work this route during blizzards, the trooper said as we stood looking at the wreckage. Too many plow drivers have disappeared over the years. County's been trying to get funding to reroute the road for a decade now. He handed me a thermos of coffee from his cruiser. You're lucky that flare trick worked. Most folks who stop here don't make it out. I quit the county job the next week and moved Sarah and me down to Florida. Found work with a shipping company in Tampa, driving trucks during the day, never at night, never in any kind of weather that could be called a storm. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night hearing voices calling for help, but I've learned to ignore them. Sarah thinks it's just stress from the job change and the baby coming, and I let her think that. Better than trying to explain the truth. The newspaper archives show 23 vehicles involved in the original 1974 crash on Route 441, with no survivors found despite extensive search efforts. But every winter since then, during major storms, rescue workers and drivers have vanished in Blood Moon Valley. The state police keep official records of equipment failures and routing errors, but unofficially, they reroute all emergency services around that area when winter weather advisories are issued. I keep emergency flares in my truck now, even here in Florida where it never snows. Light seems to be the only thing that scares them, the only thing that shows the truth of what's really there. Sometimes I think about all those bones buried in the snow, all those good people who just wanted to help someone in trouble. The creatures are patient. They can wait decades for the right storm, the right person with a kind heart who won't drive past an accident scene. If you ever find yourself driving mountain roads during a blizzard and see what looks like an accident, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't try to help. Don't listen to the voices calling your name. Sometimes the people who need help the most are the ones you should never, ever try to save. Those things in Blood Moon Valley feed on compassion, and they've had 50 years to perfect their act. They know exactly what to say, exactly how to look, to make you want to help them. I drive for the shipping company now, regular routes between Tampa and Orlando, nice, safe interstate highways with plenty of traffic. But I'll never forget that night, and I'll never stop carrying those flares. Just in case. I'm 20 years old and go to Virginia Tech studying computer science. My name's Madison Chen, and honestly, I've always been more of an indoor person. Netflix, video games, that kind of thing. But my roommates Jessica and Amber are super outdoorsy, always posting hiking photos on Instagram and talking about trail conditions. Spring break 2022, they convinced me to skip the typical Florida beach scene and drive to some mountain town in West Virginia called Crystal Falls. It'll be perfect for photos, Jessica said, and way less crowded than the usual spots. I figured why not. I'd been stressed about midterms and could use a break from campus life. We left Blacksburg on Friday afternoon, March 18th, with Jessica's Jeep packed full of hiking gear, snacks, and way too many outfit changes for what was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. The plan was straightforward. Drive 3 hours to Crystal Falls, spend Saturday hiking to some waterfalls Jessica had found online, hit up the local hot springs, then drive back Sunday evening. Jessica had found this cute bed and breakfast called Pine Valley Inn through some travel blog, and we'd booked 2 rooms for Friday and Saturday night. I remember being excited about finally doing something different, maybe getting some good photos for my own Instagram instead of just liking everyone else's adventure posts. The drive started out fine. We took I-64 west through the mountains, windows down, music loud, talking about classes and guys and summer internship plans. Amber was navigating from the passenger seat while I stretched out in the back with all our bags. The Virginia mountains were gorgeous that time of year, everything just starting to green up, dogwoods blooming white against the darker trees. We stopped at a gas station in Lewisburg around 4 p.m. to grab coffee and use the bathroom, and that's when Jessica noticed the weather report on her phone. Unexpected late-season snow system moving in from the west. "Should we turn around?" she asked, showing us the radar. There was this thick band of white heading straight for where we were going. "It's just March snow," Amber said. "It'll be pretty. And we already paid for the rooms." I wish we'd listened to that first instinct to turn around. But we were college kids who'd been planning this trip for weeks, and none of us wanted to waste the money or go back to cramming for exams. So we kept driving west as the sky got darker and the temperature started dropping. By 6 p.m., we were crawling through mountain roads in near whiteout conditions. The snow had started as light flurries around Beckley, but by the time we hit the smaller highways leading toward Crystal Falls, it was coming down so thick we could barely see the road ahead. Jessica was gripping the steering wheel with both hands, leaning forward to peer through the windshield. The GPS kept losing signal and recalculating our route, adding minutes to our arrival time every few miles. "This is crazy," I said from the back seat, watching trees disappear into the white void on either side of us. "Maybe we should find a hotel for tonight and try again tomorrow." "We're almost there," Jessica replied, though her voice sounded stressed. "The GPS says 5 more miles." That's when we saw the sign through the swirling snow. "Crystal Falls, population 847, welcome." It was one of those classic small-town signs, green with white letters, with a painted waterfall design on one corner. Jessica actually cheered when we saw it. Thank God. I was starting to think we'd end up in a ditch somewhere. The town looked exactly like the photos from the travel blog. A quaint main street with old-fashioned street lamps. Cute little shops with painted wooden signs. Everything covered in fresh snow that made it look like a Christmas card. There were people walking around despite the weather, bundled up in winter coats, warm light glowing from shop windows. It felt cozy and welcoming after that terrifying drive through the storm. We found Pine Valley Inn easily. It was right on Main Street, a beautiful Victorian building painted yellow with white trim. Icicles hanging from the wraparound porch. The elderly woman who answered the door was incredibly sweet, introducing herself as Mrs. Patterson, the owner. She had silver hair pulled back in a bun and wore this thick wool cardigan that looked handmade. "Oh my goodness, you girls made it. Come in, get out of that snow." She ushered us inside where it was warm and smelled like cinnamon and wood polish. "You're so lucky to find rooms during festival week. We're nearly booked solid." "Festival week?" Amber asked while Mrs. Patterson checked us in at an antique wooden desk. "Our annual winter celebration," she explained, handing us old-fashioned metal keys instead of key cards. "Tomorrow's the big day. Ice sculptures, local food vendors, live music. The whole town comes together. It's quite special." She made us hot chocolate in the parlor while we filled out the guest book, telling us about the festival traditions and asking where we went to school, how long we were staying. Everything felt perfectly normal and welcoming. Our rooms were on the second floor, with floral wallpaper and antique furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. I remember thinking this was exactly the kind of charming small-town experience we'd been hoping for. That night, even though it was still snowing, we walked around downtown to get a feel for the place. Main Street was maybe 6 blocks long, with a hardware store, a diner, a small grocery, a few gift shops, and what looked like a community center decorated with banners about the festival. There were people everywhere, despite the weather. Families carrying decorations, teenagers hanging streamers between the street lamps, older folks organizing tables and booths. Everyone was incredibly friendly, stopping to chat with us about where we were from, welcoming us to town. "Virginia Tech, that's wonderful," said a man arranging ice sculpture tools on a table. "You girls picked the perfect weekend to visit. Tomorrow's going to be quite a celebration." "How long have you been doing this festival?" Jessica asked. "Oh, years and years," he said with a big smile. "It's a Crystal Falls tradition. Hope you'll join us bright and early tomorrow morning." We went to bed that night, excited about the festival and relieved to be somewhere warm and safe after that scary drive. I remember lying in my antique bed, listening to the snow hitting the window, feeling grateful that we hadn't let the weather scare us off. The town seemed perfect, like something out of a movie about small-town America. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, the snow having stopped sometime during the night. Everything was covered in maybe 6 inches of fresh powder that sparkled in the sunlight. We got dressed and went downstairs for breakfast, where Mrs. Patterson served us homemade pancakes and told us all about the festival activities starting at 9 a.m. "The ice sculpting competition is always popular with young people," she said, refilling our coffee cups. "And Mary's booth has the best hot apple cider you've ever tasted." We bundled up and headed to Main Street, which had been transformed overnight. There were booths and tables everywhere, people carving elaborate ice sculptures, the smell of funnel cake and roasted nuts in the air. A bluegrass band was setting up on a small stage near the community center. It felt like the perfect small-town winter festival, exactly the kind of authentic experience you can't get in bigger cities. For the first few hours, everything was wonderful. We wandered between booths, tried local foods, watched the ice sculptors work. The whole town seemed to be there. Families with kids, elderly couples, teenagers our age. Everyone was friendly and welcoming, asking about our drive, our college, how we were enjoying the festival. The ice sculptures were incredible. Intricate designs of animals and trees and abstract shapes that caught the sunlight like prisms. But around noon, Amber noticed something that made my stomach drop. "Have we been talking to the same people all morning?" she asked quietly, while we were watching a man carve an elaborate eagle sculpture. I looked around and realized she was right. The ice sculptor working on the eagle was the same man who'd been carving it when we first arrived at 9 a.m. But instead of the sculpture being more complete 3 hours later, it looked exactly the same, like he'd been repeating the same motions over and over without actually making progress. "That's weird," Jessica said, studying the other sculptors. "That woman's been working on that flower design since we got here, but it doesn't look any different." The more we paid attention, the more wrong everything seemed. The festival had maybe 30 people total, but we'd had conversations with all of them multiple times. The food vendors were serving the same meals to the same customers in endless loops. A little girl kept dropping the same ice cream cone in the same spot, only to have her mother buy her an identical replacement from the same vendor who acted like it was the first time he'd seen them. "Welcome to Festival Week," people kept saying to us, with the same enthusiasm and exact same words they'd used hours earlier, as if they were meeting us for the first time. When we tried to leave Main Street to explore more of the town, every road led back to the town center. We'd walk 3 blocks north on what looked like a residential street, following it as it curved through a neighborhood of small houses, only to find ourselves back at the festival. Our phone's GPS showed us walking in perfect circles even when the roads appeared to go straight. "This doesn't make sense," Jessica said, staring at her phone. "We just walked 6 blocks in a straight line, but the GPS says we never left Main Street." I tried calling my mom back in Northern Virginia, but my phone would only connect to local numbers within Crystal Falls. When I dialed the number for the hardware store we could see across the street, it rang immediately. But calls to anywhere outside town just failed. The strangest part was the sun. Around 6 p.m., I realized it hadn't moved in the sky all day. The shadows were exactly the same length and direction they'd been that morning. The light had that same crisp, late-morning quality it had at 9 a.m., like time had just stopped. We went back to Pine Valley Inn feeling confused and unsettled. Mrs. Patterson greeted us at the door like we'd just arrived. "Welcome. You're so lucky to find rooms during festival week," she said with the same warm smile, the same words, the same tone she'd used the night before. Our luggage was exactly where we'd left it, but our rooms showed no signs of being slept in. The beds were perfectly made, our toiletries arranged exactly as the maid would have left them. It was like the night before had never happened, except we all remembered it clearly. That night, we decided to stay awake and see what would happen at midnight. We sat in Jessica's room, playing cards and trying to make sense of what we'd experienced. At exactly 12 a.m., we heard the sound of vehicles outside. Looking out the window, we watched as the festival booths and decorations that had been taken down for the night reappeared instantly. The ice sculptures that had been partially melted were suddenly perfect again. And the next morning, which felt like Sunday but also felt like Saturday again, everything reset. The same people set up the same festival. The ice sculptors carved the same sculptures. Mrs. Patterson welcomed us to Festival Week like it was the first time. We were trapped in some kind of temporal loop, reliving the same day over and over. By the fifth loop, we were panicking. We tried driving out of town, but every road curved back to the "Welcome to Crystal Falls" sign no matter how far we drove. The car's odometer showed we'd driven hundreds of miles while never leaving a 2-block radius. Our gas gauge never changed. Outside the town limits, there was just nothing. White void, like the world ended at Crystal Falls borders. The townspeople never aged, never changed, never deviated from their scripts. But we were changing. Jessica started looking different. Sometimes she appeared 20, sometimes 16, sometimes 25, aging and reversing randomly. I'd look in mirrors and sometimes see myself as a little kid, sometimes as an old woman. Time wasn't working normally for us either. Worse, the town's population sign kept changing. It had said 847 when we arrived. By the 10th loop, it read 850. By the 15th loop, 853. We realized we were being counted as permanent residents, slowly becoming part of whatever Crystal Falls was. On Loop 15, we found the Historical Society building tucked behind Main Street. Inside were records going back decades, guest books full of visitors who'd arrived during Festival Week and never left. Page after page of college students, families, couples, all documented as new residents. Their photos showed the same people we'd been talking to at the festival, but the dates spanned years. Some entries were from the 1990s, others from the early 2000s. We were becoming part of Crystal Falls' permanent collection, slowly forgetting our real lives outside. By Loop 23, I could barely remember Virginia Tech. The memories felt fuzzy and unimportant compared to the festival, which felt more real than anything that had happened before. But during Loop 24, something changed. The snowstorm that had brought us to Crystal Falls intensified again, heavier than it had been since that first night. The weather disrupted the pattern somehow. Instead of the festival setting up like clockwork, people seemed confused. The ice sculptor stared at his tools like he didn't remember what they were for. Mrs. Patterson forgot to offer us the same welcome speech. That's when we ran for Jessica's car. The snow was falling so thick we could barely see, But for the first time in weeks, the roads felt different. We drove blind through the storm, following what felt like muscle memory more than any visible path. Suddenly, we were on Interstate 64, 3 hours from campus, with no memory of how we'd gotten there. The car's clock showed Sunday evening, the same Sunday we should have returned from our original weekend trip. According to our phones, we'd only been gone 2 days, but it felt like we'd lived weeks in that loop. When we got back to campus and tried to look up Crystal Falls online, no such town existed in West Virginia. The travel blog Jessica had found was gone. The Pine Valley Inn's website had never existed. There was no record of us ever making reservations anywhere. But sometimes, and this is the part that still gives me nightmares, we get postcards in our campus mailboxes. No return address, just pictures of a quaint mountain town covered in snow with a message on the back. Hope you'll join us again next festival week. The postmarks are always from post offices that don't exist in towns we can't find on any map. I transferred to a different school the next semester. Being at Virginia Tech, so close to those mountains, made me feel like I was being watched. Amber dropped out entirely and moved back home to California. Jessica still goes to Tech, but she won't drive west of campus. None of us talk about what happened, even to each other. I know Crystal Falls is still out there somewhere, running its endless festival, collecting new residents from travelers who get caught in the wrong weather at the wrong time. Sometimes I wonder about the people we met there. Were they ever real, or have they been part of the loop for decades? I wonder if somewhere in those mountains, there's still a version of me helping set up ice sculptures every morning, greeting new visitors with the same enthusiastic welcome, never remembering that I was once from somewhere else. The postcards stopped coming after I graduated, but I still won't drive through West Virginia. Some places aren't meant for people like us, people who have lives to get back to. And sometimes late at night when it's snowing, I catch myself missing it. Missing the simplicity of that perfect day, the warmth of Mrs. Patterson's welcome, the beauty of those ice sculptures catching the light. That's the most terrifying part. Part of me wants to go back,